In the winter of 1901, a man stood before a modest storefront in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, staring at the remnants of what had once been his dream. Frank Winfield Woolworth was 49 years old, and though he had already achieved what many would consider remarkable success, he carried within him a hunger that went far beyond commerce, far beyond the simple accumulation of wealth. He had built an empire on the foundation of a revolutionary idea that ordinary people deserved access to beautiful things, that luxury need not be reserved for the privileged few, that a nickel or a dime could purchase dignity. But standing there in the cold, watching customers flow through his stores with their small coins and hopeful faces, Woolworth understood something profound about the nature of American ambition. The very democracy he had brought to retail, the leveling of economic barriers he had championed, would become the engine that drove him toward an aristocratic fantasy so grand, so excessive, that it would ultimately consume not just his fortune, but the lives of those he loved most. Frank Woolworth had not been born into privilege. His childhood in Rodman, New York, a farming community in Jefferson County near the Canadian border, had been marked by poverty, physical frailty, and a father whose harsh discipline left scars that would never fully heal. John Hubble Woolworth was a subsistence farmer who believed that hardship built character, that suffering was the only true teacher, and he applied this philosophy to his son with relentless severity. Young Frank was sickly, prone to respiratory ailments that made farm work nearly impossible, and his father's disappointment in him was palpable, expressed through criticism that cut deeper than any physical punishment. The boy retreated into a rich interior world, spending hours sketching elaborate buildings, designing imaginary palaces, creating on paper the grandeur that reality denied him. These drawings were not mere childhood fantasies, they were blueprints of desire, architectural manifestations of a desperate need to prove his worth, to build something so magnificent that even his father would have to acknowledge his value. At 21, having failed at farming and disappointed his family's modest expectations, Woolworth took a position as a clerk in a corner store in Watertown, New York. The work paid nothing for the first 3 months. He was learning the trade, his employer explained, and education was its own compensation. Woolworth accepted these terms without complaint, standing behind the counter from dawn until late evening, studying not just the mechanics of retail, but the psychology of customers, the way their eyes lingered on certain items, the hesitation before a purchase, the small calculations of desire versus affordability that played across their faces. He understood something that the merchants of his era had overlooked. Shopping was not merely a transaction, but a form of theater, a public performance of identity and aspiration. The store itself was a stage, and every object upon it told a story about who the customer might become. It was during these long hours behind the counter that Woolworth conceived the idea that would transform American retail. Watching customers deliberate over prices, seeing how even a few pennies could mean the difference between purchase and regret, he imagined a store where every item cost exactly 5 cents. The simplicity was revolutionary. No haggling, no complex pricing structures, no anxiety about whether one could afford to inquire about an object's cost. Just a single, democratic price that anyone could understand, anyone could afford. In 1879, his employer allowed him to test this concept with a special sale table, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Customers who had never dared to purchase decorative items suddenly found themselves able to own small luxuries: a porcelain figurine, a lace handkerchief, a picture frame. The 5-cent table didn't just sell merchandise, it sold the possibility of a more beautiful life. But Woolworth's first independent venture, a 5-cent store opened in Utica, New York in 1879, failed within months. The location was poor, the inventory insufficient, and Woolworth himself was still learning the intricate choreography of retail management. Yet failure, rather than deterring him, seemed to crystallize his vision. He opened a second store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania later that same year and incorporated a crucial innovation. Alongside items priced at 5 cents, he added a selection priced at 10 cents. The 5 and dime was born, and with it a revolution in how Americans shopped, how they understood value, and how they related to the material world around them. The success was neither instant nor inevitable. Woolworth worked with manic intensity, often sleeping in the back rooms of his stores, personally arranging displays, studying which items sold and which languished, developing an almost supernatural ability to predict consumer desire. He traveled to Europe, purchasing direct from manufacturers, cutting out middlemen and reducing costs while maintaining quality. He understood that his customers were not merely buying objects, they were buying self-respect. The ability to present themselves to the world as people of taste and discernment despite their limited means. Every item in a Woolworth store was carefully selected to offer not just utility, but beauty, not just function, but aspiration. By the turn of the century, Woolworth operated dozens of stores across America, and his annual profits had climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was wealthy by any reasonable measure, but wealth alone could never satisfy the hunger that drove him. He had proven his business acumen, demonstrated his ability to read and shape consumer behavior, built an empire from a simple idea executed with obsessive precision. Yet the boy who had sketched palaces in his father's farmhouse, the young man who had endured poverty and paternal contempt, wanted something more than financial success. He wanted architectural immortality. He wanted to build something so magnificent that it would stand as permanent proof of his transformation from farm boy to aristocrat, from nobody to someone whose name would echo through generations. In 1901, Woolworth purchased a plot of land on Fifth Avenue between 56th and 57th Streets, in the heart of what was rapidly becoming New York City's most exclusive residential district. The lot cost $375,000, an astronomical sum, but Woolworth paid in cash without hesitation. He had already begun designing his palace, not on paper but in his mind, where it had existed in various forms since childhood. This would not merely be a large house or even a mansion in the conventional sense. It would be a monument, a statement, an architectural declaration that Frank Winfield Woolworth had transcended the limitations of his birth and claimed his place among America's royalty. He hired the architectural firm of C.P.H. Gilbert, specialists in the Beaux Arts style that dominated Gilded Age Manhattan, and instructed them to create something unprecedented, a private residence that would rival the great palaces of Europe, that would announce to everyone who saw it that its owner was not simply rich, but cultured, refined, worthy of aristocratic comparison. The plans that emerged were breathtaking in their ambition. The mansion would rise 5 stories, encompassing over 50 rooms with facades of white marble inspired by French Renaissance chateaux. But mere size and style were insufficient for Woolworth's vision. Every detail, every material, every artistic element had to be superlative, had to represent the finest that money could buy and taste could imagine.
The construction process became an obsession that consumed Woolworth completely. He was involved in every decision, approving every sketch, examining every sample of marble and wood and fabric. He traveled to Europe repeatedly, purchasing entire rooms from French palaces, buying carved paneling from Italian villas, acquiring tapestries that had once hung in medieval castles. He commissioned reproductions of furniture owned by Napoleon Bonaparte, including exact copies of the emperor's desk and bed. The symbolism was not subtle. Woolworth saw himself as a different kind of conqueror, one who had seized territory not through military force but through commercial genius, who had built an empire not of colonies but of stores, who had crowned himself not with political power but with architectural magnificence. The mansion's design incorporated elements from multiple French chateaux, creating a kind of architectural symphony that referenced the Loire Valley, Versailles, and the great Parisian Hôtel Particulier. The exterior featured elaborate carved limestone details, wrought iron balconies, a steep mansard roof punctuated by dormer windows and copper cresting. The entrance, set back from the street through a small courtyard, was designed to evoke the private hotels of French nobility, places where the public world ended and aristocratic privacy began. This threshold was critical to Woolworth's conception. His mansion would not simply face the street like ordinary buildings, but would maintain a dignified distance, a spatial buffer that separated the common realm from the exalted world within. Inside, the scale and splendor were overwhelming. The entrance hall rose 2 full stories, its walls clad in marble, its ceiling supported by classical columns, its floor an intricate pattern of colored stone imported from Italy. A grand staircase swept upward, its balustrade crafted from bronze and onyx, each step wide enough that a woman in the elaborate gowns of the era could ascend with dramatic grace. The stairs themselves became a stage for entrances and exits, a setting where Woolworth imagined his family making impressions, commanding attention, embodying the grace and refinement he associated with true aristocracy. The main reception rooms occupied the entire first floor: a drawing room, a music room, a library, a dining room, each one a masterpiece of decorative arts. The drawing room featured walls covered in silk damask, furniture upholstered in Aubuchon tapestry, a ceiling painted with allegorical scenes by European artists Woolworth had commissioned specifically for this purpose. The music room housed a pipe organ that cost over $1 million, one of the largest and most sophisticated musical instruments ever installed in a private residence. The organ's console was carved from rare woods, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and its pipes, numbering in the thousands, were hidden behind ornate grillwork that allowed sound to flow through while maintaining the room's aesthetic unity. Woolworth, who had no musical training and rarely attended concerts, insisted on this organ because great houses, true palaces, had organs. It was not about music, but about symbols, about possessing the markers of cultural sophistication. The library walls were lined with custom-built bookcases made from Santo Domingo mahogany, their glass doors protecting volumes bound in leather, many of them purchased by the yard for their appearance rather than their content. Woolworth was not a reader, not a scholar, but he understood that libraries signified intellectual depth, that books represented cultivation, and so his palace would have books, shelves upon shelves of them, creating an impression of learned sophistication whether or not they were ever opened. The dining room, perhaps the most spectacular space in the mansion, could seat 40 guests at a table custom-made in France, its surface a single piece of polished walnut 20 feet long. The walls were covered in hand-painted Chinese wallpaper depicting elaborate garden scenes, each panel an original artwork that had taken craftsmen months to complete. Above, a chandelier holding 200 electric bulbs hung from a ceiling decorated with gold leaf and hand-carved plasterwork. The construction costs quickly exceeded Woolworth's initial estimates. What he had imagined might cost $3 or $4 million was rapidly approaching $10 million, a sum so vast that even with his considerable fortune, it represented a significant portion of his net worth. But Woolworth, possessed by his vision, could not stop, could not compromise, could not allow financial practicality to interfere with his monument to himself. He borrowed against future earnings, liquidated investments, poured every available dollar into the mansion's completion. His business managers grew concerned, warning him that he was overextending, that the mansion was becoming a financial liability. Woolworth dismissed their worries with imperial confidence. The stores were generating enormous profits, the company was expanding, and his vision, this palace that would stand as permanent testament to his rise, was worth any price. The mansion was completed in 1904, and its unveiling to New York society was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Woolworth understood instinctively that wealth alone could not secure social acceptance. The Vanderbilts had learned this lesson, as had the Goulds and the Fisks before them. Old New York, the families whose fortunes predated the Civil War, whose names appeared in the original social register, maintained invisible but impenetrable barriers against the newly rich, dismissing them as vulgar parvenus regardless of their bank balances. But Woolworth had studied these barriers carefully, and he believed that architecture could accomplish what mere money could not. A house magnificent enough, cultured enough, European enough in its references and refinement might serve as a kind of social passport, granting entry to circles that would otherwise remain forever closed. He hired publicists to ensure that every major newspaper covered the mansion's completion, that photographs appeared in society columns and architectural journals, that the scale and cost of the project became common knowledge. The press coverage was extensive and largely favorable. Journalists described the mansion as a triumph of taste, a palace worthy of European royalty, a symbol of American achievement and refined sensibility. But beneath the laudatory prose, there was often a subtle undertone of mockery, a suggestion that Woolworth's efforts were somehow excessive, that the man who had made his fortune selling trinkets for nickels and dimes was playing dress-up in borrowed European finery, that no amount of marble and gilding could transform a shopkeeper into an aristocrat. Woolworth felt these barbs deeply, though he never acknowledged them publicly. He had hoped that the mansion would serve as an entrance point into New York's most exclusive social circles, that invitations would flow naturally from the grandeur of his residence, that Mrs. Astor and her circle of 400 would recognize him as an equal. But the invitations came slowly, if at all. The old families appreciated beauty and understood its value, but they also understood pedigree, lineage, the intangible qualities that distinguished those born to privilege from those who had merely acquired it. Woolworth could build a palace, could fill it with treasures, could host elaborate dinners and musicales, but he could not erase his origins, could not retroactively create generations of refined ancestry, could not transform his father's harsh farmhouse into a distinguished family estate. His wife, Jenny Creighton Woolworth, whom he had married in 1876, when both were young and poor, found the mansion overwhelming and ultimately alienating. Jenny had been content with their earlier, more modest homes, had never sought social prominence or aristocratic pretensions. She was a practical woman, raised in similar circumstances to Frank, and she understood the value of money because she remembered what it meant to have none. The mansion, with its 50 rooms and battalion of servants, its European furnishings and priceless artworks, felt to her less like a home than a museum, a place where one moved carefully, conscious always of the value of objects, the fragility of beauty, the weight of Frank's ambitions.
She developed nervous complaints, ailments that had no clear physical cause, but manifested in headaches, exhaustion, and general withdrawal from the social performance Frank desperately wanted her to lead. The couple had 3 daughters, Helena, Edna, and Jessie, and it was upon them that Woolworth increasingly focused his social ambitions. If he could not fully integrate himself into old New York society, perhaps his daughters could. They had been born into wealth, had known nothing but privilege, had been educated by private tutors, and finished in European schools. They spoke French fluently, played piano with competence if not passion, understood the intricate rituals of formal dining and ballroom etiquette. They were, in every measurable way, young ladies of refinement and culture, precisely the kind of daughters that aristocratic families produced. Woolworth envisioned brilliant marriages for them, alliances with established families that would cement his own social position and create for his grandchildren the unquestioned legitimacy he himself could never fully claim. But raising daughters in a palace created its own complications. The girls grew up surrounded by beauty so extreme that ordinary loveliness ceased to move them, by luxury so constant that gratitude became impossible, by wealth so absolute that they had no framework for understanding limitation or consequence. They were waited upon constantly, maids to dress them, servants to bring meals, chauffeurs to drive them anywhere they wished to go. They never learned to cook or clean or manage a household budget, skills that Woolworth considered beneath them, unsuitable for young women of their station. They were ornamental creatures, carefully cultivated but fundamentally untested, beautiful flowers grown in a hothouse who had never felt wind or weather. Helena, the eldest daughter, married Charles McCann in 1910, a union that pleased Woolworth enormously. McCann came from an established New York family, his father having made a respectable fortune in machinery manufacturing, and the marriage seemed to represent exactly the kind of social integration Woolworth had sought. The wedding was held at the mansion, an elaborate affair that cost over $100,000 and was covered extensively in newspapers across the country. Woolworth spared no expense. Imported flowers filled every room. An orchestra played throughout the evening. The wedding cake was 7 feet tall and decorated with spun sugar sculptures. He walked his daughter down the grand staircase he had built partly for this very purpose, imagining that his ancestors, those poor farmers he had worked so hard to transcend, were somehow watching, witnessing his triumph, understanding finally that he had achieved something extraordinary.
Edna, the middle daughter, married Franklin Hutton in 1907, and this marriage would prove the most consequential of all, though not in ways anyone could have predicted. Hutton was a stockbroker from a respectable but not particularly distinguished family, handsome and charming, but without significant personal wealth. He worked for a brokerage firm his father had founded, and he possessed the kind of easy social confidence that often accompanies those born into comfortable circumstances without the burden of great wealth. Woolworth approved of the match, seeing in Hutton a malleable son-in-law who might be shaped according to his vision, who could perhaps take an active role in the Woolworth business empire, ensuring that the family's commercial dominance continued beyond Frank's own lifetime.
The couple's only child, Barbara Woolworth Hutton, was born on November 14, 1912, in the Fifth Avenue mansion in a bedroom on the 3rd floor that had been specially prepared for Edna's confinement. The birth was difficult and prolonged, and Edna's recovery was complicated by what we would now recognize as severe postpartum depression, but which was then diagnosed vaguely as nervous exhaustion and treated with bed rest and isolation. The baby, meanwhile, was placed in the care of a succession of nurses and nannies, professionals who managed the mechanics of infant care, while Edna remained largely absent, sleeping through days and nights in darkened rooms, refusing visitors, unable to connect with the child she had brought into the world. Woolworth was delighted by his granddaughter's arrival. Here finally was the next generation, the child who would inherit not just his fortune, but the social position he had worked so hard to establish. He commissioned portraits of the infant, had a suite of nursery rooms decorated in the mansion specifically for her use, purchased toys and furnishings with his characteristic excess. But even in these early months, there were signs of the tragedy that would unfold. Edna's depression deepened rather than lifted, and the distance between mother and daughter that had formed in those first weeks never truly closed. Barbara would grow up surrounded by wealth unimaginable to most people, but starved for the one thing money could not purchase: genuine maternal love, the kind of secure attachment that creates psychological resilience and emotional stability. In November 1917, when Barbara was 5 years old, Edna Woolworth Hutton died under circumstances that would be debated and speculated about for decades. The official cause of death was listed as suffocation from ear infection, a middle ear infection that had somehow led to mastoiditis, which had allegedly caused complications resulting in asphyxiation. But the medical explanation satisfied almost no one who knew the family. Edna had been found in her room at the Plaza Hotel, where she had been staying separately from her husband, unconscious and surrounded by bottles of patent medicines and tonics that were common at the time, but often contained significant amounts of alcohol and opiates. Whether her death was accidental, an unintentional overdose by a woman self-medicating for chronic pain and depression, or intentional, a deliberate escape from a life that had become unbearable, was never conclusively determined. The family maintained the official story with grim determination, but rumors spread quickly through New York society. Suicide was not merely tragic in 1917, it was scandalous, shameful, a moral failure that reflected badly not just on the deceased, but on the entire family. If Edna had taken her own life, it suggested that something was profoundly wrong in the Woolworth household, that the magnificent palace and vast fortune had failed to produce happiness, that perhaps wealth itself was somehow corrupting or toxic. The whispers followed Barbara throughout her childhood. Other children repeating things they had heard their parents say, society matrons exchanging knowing glances when the Huttons were mentioned, newspapers wedding veiled references to tragic circumstances and mysterious death. For Woolworth, his daughter's death was devastating on multiple levels. He had loved Edna, though he perhaps had never truly understood her, never grasped the depth of her unhappiness, or the ways in which the very wealth and status he had worked to provide had become a kind of prison for her. Her death was also a failure of his most fundamental belief that money could solve problems, that sufficient wealth could purchase happiness, security, and contentment. Edna had wanted for nothing materially, had lived in splendor, had married well, had produced a healthy child. By every objective measure, her life should have been happy. That it was not, that she had apparently found it unendurable, challenged the entire foundation of Woolworth's worldview. He threw himself into business with renewed intensity, as if success in commerce could somehow compensate for failure in family life. The F.W. Woolworth Company was approaching its zenith, with hundreds of stores across America and expanding internationally. In 1913, Woolworth had realized another of his architectural dreams, the Woolworth Building, a 60-story skyscraper in Lower Manhattan that was, upon its completion, the tallest building in the world. The structure cost $13 million, which Woolworth paid in cash, and it was designed by architect Cass Gilbert in the neo-Gothic style, its terracotta facade decorated with elaborate carved details. Its lobby, a cathedral-like space with marble walls and a vaulted ceiling covered in glass mosaics. The Woolworth Building was, in many ways, a more successful monument than the Fifth Avenue mansion. It served a practical purpose, housing the company's headquarters, while simultaneously announcing Woolworth's importance to the world. Its height was not merely impressive, but symbolically significant, placing Woolworth literally above his competitors, above the old money families whose social approval he still craved, above everyone. The building's nickname, the Cathedral of Commerce, pleased him enormously. It suggested that business itself was a kind of religion, that commercial success was a form of spiritual achievement, that his life's work had meaning beyond mere profit. But the mansion, which had once represented his greatest triumph, was becoming increasingly problematic. The operating costs were staggering. A staff of 30 servants, enormous heating bills, constant maintenance and repairs, property taxes that climbed each year as Fifth Avenue real estate values soared. Woolworth had always been attentive to expenses in his business, understanding that profit came from careful management of costs, but he seemed unable to apply this same discipline to his personal residence. The mansion had to be maintained at the highest level, had to remain impeccable because any sign of neglect or economy would suggest that he could no longer afford it, that his fortune was declining, that he had overreached. His wife Jenny's health continued to deteriorate. She spent increasing amounts of time in her rooms, emerging only occasionally for family dinners or holidays, preferring isolation to the constant performance that living in the mansion seemed to require. Woolworth hired specialists, the finest doctors money could employ, but they could offer no cure for what ailed her, because her illness was fundamentally one of spirit rather than body. She had never wanted this life, had never shared Frank's social ambitions, and the mansion that was supposed to represent their success felt to her like an elaborate tomb, beautiful and cold and ultimately lifeless. Barbara, meanwhile, was growing up in this atmosphere of gilded melancholy, raised primarily by servants and governesses, seeing her grandfather occasionally but her father rarely. Franklin Hutton, freed from financial worry by his marriage to a Woolworth heiress and by the substantial trust fund Woolworth had established for Edna, spent increasing amounts of time away from home, pursuing business interests and social pleasures that did not include his daughter. Barbara was developing into a beautiful child, with large eyes and delicate features, but there was something haunted about her even in early photographs, a wariness that seemed inappropriate for one so young and so privileged. Woolworth doted on her when he remembered to, showering her with extravagant gifts, a miniature car she could actually drive around the mansion's grounds, a collection of dolls from Paris dressed in haute couture, a Shetland pony and custom-built stable. But gifts, however expensive, could not substitute for consistent presence, for emotional availability, for the kind of attentive love that creates security. Barbara learned early that people came and went. Her mother had vanished, her father was perpetually absent, even her grandfather's attention was sporadic and unpredictable. The only constants in her life were the mansion itself, vast and echoing, and the servants who cared for her physical needs while maintaining the professional distance their positions required. In 1918, just a year after Edna's death, Woolworth's wife Jenny died as well. The official cause was pneumonia, but like Edna, she had been declining for years, withdrawing gradually from life, until her death seemed less like a sudden tragedy than a slow fade into inevitable darkness. Woolworth, at 66, found himself alone in the 50-room mansion, surrounded by beauty and treasure, but isolated in ways that wealth could not remedy. His daughters Helena and Jessie had their own families, their own concerns, and visited dutifully but infrequently. Barbara was 6 years old, a child who needed care and consistency that Woolworth, despite his wealth and despite his love for her, was constitutionally unable to provide. He began to suffer from what his doctors diagnosed as septic teeth, chronic dental infections that caused severe pain and may have contributed to systemic health problems. The treatments available in the early 20th century were primitive and largely ineffective, and Woolworth endured years of escalating pain that affected his mood, his judgment, and his ability to focus on business. He became increasingly erratic, making impulsive decisions, trusting advisors who flattered him while quietly pillaging the company's resources, losing the careful attention to detail that had made him successful. The business itself remained profitable, the Woolworth stores were so well established, the brand so strong that it could sustain considerable mismanagement, but the tight control Woolworth had always maintained was slipping. The mansion, which had once been filled with dinner parties and musicales, grew quiet. Woolworth spent his evenings alone in the library, surrounded by the books he had never read, or in the music room where the million-dollar organ sat silent because no one remained who could play it. The grand staircase, which he had imagined his daughters descending in ball gowns to meet suitors and admirers, echoed with the footsteps of servants going about their duties. The dining room, built to seat 40, typically served one. The entire edifice, conceived as a stage for social triumph, had become instead a monument to isolation, a palace populated by ghosts and memories, and the constant whisper of what might have been. Frank Winfield Woolworth, died on April 8, 1919, at the age of 66 in the Fifth Avenue mansion that had consumed so much of his fortune and ambition. The cause of death was officially listed as septicemia, blood poisoning that had spread throughout his system from the chronic dental infections that had tormented him for years. But those who knew him well understood that he had also died from something less tangible but perhaps more devastating: the gradual realization that his palace had not delivered what he had built it to provide. The social acceptance he craved had remained elusive. The happiness he believed wealth could purchase had proven tragically out of reach. And the family dynasty he hoped to establish was already showing signs of the fractures that would eventually destroy it completely. His funeral was held in the mansion's grand drawing room, the same space where he had once imagined hosting glittering social events that would cement his position among New York's elite. Instead, it became the setting for a somber service attended by business associates, a few distant relatives, and notably few representatives from the old money families whose acceptance he had so desperately sought. The newspapers covered his death extensively, but the tone was revealing. Woolworth was praised as a commercial genius, a retail innovator who had transformed American shopping, a self-made man who had risen from poverty to build an empire. But there was little mention of his social standing, no lengthy tributes from society figures, no suggestions that his passing represented a significant loss to New York's cultural or aristocratic circles. He had remained, to the end, the five-and-dime king, respected for his business acumen, but never fully embraced by the world he had worked so hard to enter.
His estate, valued at approximately $30 million at the time of his death, was substantial, but not as vast as many had assumed. The mansion alone had consumed nearly a third of his peak wealth, and the operating costs over 15 years had drained millions more. His will divided the fortune among his surviving daughters and established a trust fund for his granddaughter Barbara, who, at 7 years old, became one of the wealthiest children in America. The trust was structured to provide her with income immediately and full control of the principal when she turned 21. Woolworth's lawyers had crafted these provisions carefully, believing that the structure would protect Barbara from fortune hunters and ensure that the Woolworth wealth would continue to generate prosperity for future generations. They could not have been more tragically mistaken. The mansion itself passed to Helena, the eldest daughter, though she had no intention of living there. She and her husband maintained their own residence and found the scale and expense of the Fifth Avenue palace overwhelming. For several years, the house sat largely empty, with the skeleton staff maintaining it while the family debated what to do with the property that had become more burden than asset. The maintenance costs continued to drain the estate, $30,000 annually just to keep it heated and staffed at minimal levels, additional tens of thousands for repairs and taxes. The mansion that Frank Woolworth had built to stand as permanent monument to his success was becoming, even before his death, an albatross around his family's collective neck. Barbara Hutton, meanwhile, was growing up in a world of almost incomprehensible wealth but devastating emotional poverty. Her father, Franklin Hutton, remarried quickly, first to Irene Curley Bodd, then, after that marriage failed, to a succession of other women, each relationship lasting only a few years before dissolving in acrimony and expensive divorce settlements. Franklin seemed to view his daughter primarily as a financial asset, the source of the Woolworth money that funded his lifestyle, and his attentions toward her were sporadic and performative, focused on public appearances and photographs that suggested paternal devotion without requiring actual emotional investment. She was raised by a rotating cast of governesses and tutors, none of whom stayed long enough to provide genuine stability. The women hired to care for her were professionals doing a job, and while many were kind and competent, they understood the fundamental nature of their relationship with Barbara. They could be dismissed at any moment, their employment dependent on the whims of Franklin Hutton or the trustees managing Barbara's fortune. Barbara learned not to become too attached, not to expect permanence, not to trust that anyone who claimed to care about her would actually remain. These lessons, learned in the most expensive homes and most exclusive schools money could provide, would shape her entire life, creating patterns of behavior and relationship that would repeat with tragic consistency for decades.
The press discovered Barbara early and never let her go. She was a perfect story, the orphaned heiress, the poor little rich girl, the child who had everything money could buy but lacked the one thing that mattered most. Newspapers and magazines ran features about her wardrobe, her homes, her travels, treating a child as if she were a public commodity, a figure whose wealth entitled the world to constant scrutiny and commentary. Barbara was followed by photographers, written about by columnists, discussed at dinner parties by people who had never met her but felt entitled to opinions about her life. The attention was relentless and invasive, making normal childhood impossible, making genuine friendship nearly inconceivable because she could never be certain whether people liked her for herself or for her fortune. By the early 1920s, the Fifth Avenue mansion was becoming untenable. Property taxes had increased dramatically as the neighborhood continued to develop into one of the world's most expensive commercial districts. The city was growing upward, and the land occupied by the Woolworth mansion was now worth far more as a potential site for an apartment building or commercial structure than as a private residence. The family received multiple offers from developers, each one astronomical in dollar terms, but painful in symbolic significance. To sell the mansion would be to admit that Frank Woolworth's dream had failed, that the palace he had built as permanent testament to his rise could not even survive a decade beyond his death. In 1925, after years of debate and delay, the family finally accepted an offer from a real estate developer who planned to demolish the mansion and construct a luxury apartment building on the site. The sale price was reported to be approximately $3 million, a substantial sum, but less than a third of what Woolworth had spent building the house just 20 years earlier. The economics were inescapable. The mansion cost more to maintain than it could ever generate in value, and the land beneath it was worth exponentially more than the structure upon it. But for those who had known Frank Woolworth, who had witnessed his obsessive attention to every detail of the mansion's construction, the demolition represented a kind of posthumous defeat, a final proof that architectural grandeur alone could not purchase immortality. The demolition process was methodical and brutal. Workers with sledgehammers and eventually dynamite, reducing limestone and marble and steel to rubble, erasing in weeks what had taken years to build. Passers-by on Fifth Avenue stopped to watch the destruction, some photographing the process, others simply staring in mournful fascination at the collapse of something that had once seemed so permanent. The mansion that Frank Woolworth had built to stand for generations, that was supposed to announce his family's arrival among America's aristocracy, lasted barely 2 decades before being deemed obsolete, too expensive to maintain, more valuable dead than alive. In its place rose a 15-story apartment building, elegant but unremarkable, one of dozens of similar structures that came to define Fifth Avenue in the 1920s. The residents of the building had no idea they were living on the site of the Woolworth Palace, no sense of the dreams that had been dreamed there, the tragedies that had unfolded within its walls, the desperate social ambitions that had driven its construction. The city had moved on, as cities always do, consuming and repurposing and forgetting with equal efficiency. Barbara Hutton, meanwhile, came into her full inheritance in 1933 when she turned 21. The trust fund that had been carefully structured to protect her instead became a target, a fortune so vast that it attracted schemers and manipulators and men who saw in this beautiful, lonely young woman not a person but an opportunity. She married 7 times over the course of her life, to a Georgian prince, a Danish count, a Hollywood leading man, a playboy, a baron, a diplomat, and a Laotian prince. Each marriage began with hope and declarations of eternal love and ended with disappointment, betrayal, and expensive divorce settlements. The pattern was established early and repeated with tragic consistency for decades. Barbara would meet a man, believe that he loved her for herself rather than her money, marry quickly, and then gradually realize that she had once again confused attention with affection, that the devotion being shown her was conditional on her continued financial generosity.
She spent her inheritance with manic desperation, as if money itself was toxic and needed to be purged from her system. She purchased homes she never lived in, jewelry she never wore, gifts for people who disappeared as soon as the checks cleared. She supported entire communities of hangers-on, friends who weren't really friends, advisors who gave terrible advice, relatives who materialized whenever money was needed and vanished when emotional support was required. She was surrounded by people but profoundly alone, wealthy beyond measure, but emotionally bankrupt.
living in luxurious hotels and magnificent estates, but never finding a place that felt like home. The press coverage grew more vicious as she aged. The poor little rich girl narrative that had once generated some measure of sympathy curdled into contempt. Columnists mocked her failed marriages, her weight fluctuations, her increasingly erratic behavior. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol of wealth's inability to purchase happiness, proof that money without love, without purpose, without genuine human connection, was not just insufficient, but perhaps actively destructive. The same newspapers that had chronicled her grandfather's rise now documented her decline, finding in her story a satisfying morality play about the emptiness of material success. Barbara struggled with addiction throughout her adult life. Alcohol, prescription drugs, anything that might dull the constant ache of loneliness and the nagging suspicion that she was unlovable, that her worth began and ended with her bank balance. She underwent numerous treatments, checking in and out of expensive sanitariums and clinics, surrounded by the best medical care money could provide, but never addressing the fundamental trauma that drove her destructive behavior, the childhood spent in that vast, cold mansion, the mother who had died when she needed her most, the father who had valued her fortune more than her person, the grandfather whose ambitions had created wealth but not happiness, security but not love. By the 1960s, Barbara's fortune had been substantially depleted. The $50 million that she had inherited, worth perhaps $1 billion in today's currency, had been steadily drained by bad investments, generous gifts, divorce settlements, and the enormous cost of maintaining the lifestyle expected of someone with her background. She still had money, still lived comfortably by any objective standard, but the vast Woolworth fortune that was supposed to sustain generations had been largely exhausted in a single lifetime. The dynasty Frank Woolworth had hoped to establish never materialized. His daughters had lived comfortable but unremarkable lives. His granddaughter had become famous but not happy, wealthy but not secure, known to millions but truly understood by almost no one. Barbara Hutton died on May 11, 1979, in Los Angeles, at the age of 66, the same age at which her grandfather had died 60 years earlier. She was found in her bed at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, weighing less than 90 pounds, her body ravaged by decades of neglect and self-destruction. The cause of death was listed as heart attack, but it was really the culmination of a lifetime of accumulated trauma, unprocessed grief, and the corrosive effects of wealth without purpose or love without condition. Her estate, once valued at $50 million, had shrunk to approximately $3,000. Almost everything had been spent, given away, or lost to the succession of men and hangers-on who had circulated through her life. The Woolworth fortune, built so carefully over decades, had been completely dissipated in a span of 46 years. The news of her death generated headlines worldwide, but the coverage was notably lacking in grief or genuine sympathy. Instead, Barbara's death was treated as the inevitable conclusion to a predictable narrative, the final chapter in a cautionary tale that had been unfolding in public for decades. Columnists wrote about the curse of wealth, the tragedy of inherited money, the emptiness of material success, abstractions that allowed them to moralize about Barbara's life without actually grappling with the specific circumstances of her suffering, the particular failures of family and society that had shaped her fate. The story of the Woolworth mansion and the family it was built to glorify contains no simple lessons, no easy morals about the dangers of wealth or the emptiness of social ambition. Frank Woolworth was not a villain. He was a man who had risen from genuine poverty through intelligence, hard work, and innovative thinking, who had genuinely believed that architectural magnificence could purchase social acceptance and family happiness. His granddaughter Barbara was not simply a spoiled heiress squandering her inheritance. She was a traumatized child who grew into a wounded adult, seeking love in all the wrong places, trying to fill an emotional void with the only resource she had in abundance: money. The mansion itself, demolished less than 24 years after its completion, stands as a monument to ambition's limits. A reminder that buildings, however magnificent, cannot substitute for genuine human connection. That wealth, however vast, cannot purchase the intangible qualities that make life meaningful: love, security, belonging, purpose. Frank Woolworth built his palace believing it would announce his arrival in the highest echelons of society, that it would create a dynasty that would endure for generations, that it would prove finally and permanently that he was somebody, that his life had mattered. Instead, it became a burden to his heirs, a money pit that drained resources without providing genuine value, and ultimately a pile of rubble cleared away to make room for something more practical, more economically rational, more suited to the modern world.
Today, no physical trace of the Woolworth mansion remains. The apartment building that replaced it has itself been replaced by newer construction. The treasures that filled the mansion's 50 rooms are scattered, some in museums, some in private collections, most lost to history, their connection to the Woolworth story forgotten. The Woolworth building in Lower Manhattan still stands, no longer the world's tallest, but still impressive, still beautiful, still serving its practical purpose more than a century after its construction. It has outlasted the mansion because it was built for use rather than display, for function rather than social positioning, as a tool of commerce rather than a monument to ego. Barbara Hutton's life has become the stuff of Hollywood legend. Books have been written, television movies produced, her story endlessly recycled as entertainment and cautionary tale. But in all this coverage, in all the retrospectives and biographies and documentaries, something essential often gets lost. The human reality of a child who never recovered from her mother's death, who spent her entire life seeking a love and security that had been denied her from the beginning, who had access to every material comfort but lacked the one thing she needed most, someone who loved her unconditionally, who valued her for herself rather than her fortune, who remained present and consistent and emotionally available. The tragedy of the Woolworth mansion is not simply that it was demolished, though that demolition represents a kind of failure. The real tragedy is what it represents: a dream that could not deliver on its promise, a fortune that created more problems than it solved, an architectural monument to success that became instead a symbol of isolation, loneliness, and the fundamental inability of wealth to purchase the things that actually matter. Frank Woolworth worked tirelessly to escape poverty, to prove his worth, to build something magnificent. He succeeded beyond his wildest childhood dreams, amassing a fortune and constructing a palace worthy of European royalty. But in the end, his palace couldn't save his daughter from despair, couldn't protect his granddaughter from a lifetime of searching for love in all the wrong places, couldn't create the dynasty he had envisioned, and couldn't even survive long enough to be remembered as anything more than a historical footnote, a brief moment of extravagance in a city that has never paused long enough to mourn what it destroys. The Woolworth mansion is gone. The fortune is gone. The family name, once synonymous with American retail innovation, is now mostly forgotten. The stores themselves having faded into history, victims of changing markets and evolving consumer preferences. What remains is a story, tragic, cautionary, and profoundly human, about the limits of ambition, the dangers of confusing wealth with worth, and the fundamental truth that no palace, however magnificent, can substitute for love, that no fortune, however vast, can purchase happiness, and that the things we build to immortalize ourselves often prove far more fragile than the dreams that inspired them. In the end, Frank Woolworth's greatest creation was not his mansion, or his stores, or even his fortune. It was the unintended legacy of suffering he left behind. The lesson taught through 3 generations that money, while it can solve many problems, cannot heal trauma, cannot create genuine connection, and cannot, no matter how desperately we wish otherwise,
protect those we love from the consequences of our own unfulfilled longings and unexamined ambitions. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.